Are we a little early to start, or should we get going?
About 2.5 minutes.
You could get going, I think.
Cool. And this is being recorded, right? So anyone can catch up if they're missing it.
It may or may not.
Well, we're going to try to. Yeah. Shut down Slack. Yeah, good idea. Okay. Let's get stuck in. So, thank you for the very kind introduction, Mike. It's kind of funny. I've been following Mike's blog for a long time as well and picking up lots of stuff that he's been writing about. But when I think about, I mean, whenever you do a presentation, someone asks, can you give me a quick bio on yourself? And the thing that you want to talk about your passions and the stuff that you want to talk about. And the thing that I keep coming back to is unit testing. I get excited by it. I don't know if there's something wrong with me. I also like to hand code XML and I like XSLT, but I really do like unit testing. And recently I was doing some refactoring on the Weblog project, and it involved rewriting a lot of tests, and you just kind of get into the zone. So this is what I wanted to talk about, was unit testing in Sitecore. As Mike said at the start, it can be very difficult to work out how to navigate and how to work out how to unit test your stuff, especially because the first hurdle that many people hit up against is the fact that mocking items used to be difficult. They're actually really, really easy now, and I'll show you how. So yeah, it's helpful to see other examples of how you can do it. If this isn't your first session of the day, this is the second session. You would have already seen this, and you would have already seen Akshay talking about. We're in a very weird time in the world right now. This is we're facing a pandemic that's affecting everybody globally. So if we have the capacity to, it's good to get behind and donate and try and help those that are on the front line fighting this thing every day. So SUGCON is supporting these particular pursuits. So if you can, and you can support it as well, that'd be great. Now, in between sessions, or if you get bored of listening to me, feel free to jump on over to the virtual breakout room / chill out lounge. One of the things about going to any conference, especially any Sitecore conference, it's not just about the content that you're getting, it's also about making connections with people. It's also about catching up with all of your virtual Sitecore friends. And so by doing this event in the format that we're doing now, you kind of miss out on that a little bit. So it's really good that the SUGCON organizers have got together the chill out room, so you can still catch up with some of your the Sitecore people that you only get a chance to catch up with whenever you go to conferences. So jump on in there. Disclaimer, please don't share the link or the password on any other channels, purely because we don't want Sitecore coming in and trolling everybody. And with that, it's time for presentation. So I almost have no slides for you, so I hope that excites you. This is all about the walkthrough and the code. If I can get that to go down for a minute, there we go. So what I'm going to be walking through is this is the Weblog module. By default, it comes with this component here, which is an entry posts component. So the idea here is on a blog page, I can list out the categories that particular post has been tagged to. So I've recreated that in two rendering technologies. I've got a controller rendering here spitting out this part, and then I've got a view rendering spitting out this part. I'll explain why I've got two components in a moment. So this is what we're going to be investigating and testing. So if I go and find my Visual Studio, okay, I hope that's not too small. Can everyone see the Solution Explorer? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so I said the first component is a controller rendering. Now, in reality, this is absolute overkill for what we're doing with that component. You do not need a controller rendering here. More appropriate would be a view rendering. The reason I'm using a controller rendering is just I found through the explanation of this, it's a little bit easier if you're looking at a controller and you can clearly make distinction between model and what's going on. So let's start by having a look through this code. Okay, so what are we doing? In the index method, We're accessing the context item. We're grabbing the category field off that. Okay, we're going to grab the items there that are the categories. Sorry, I should probably explain if you haven't used Weblog before. The category field is a field that is holding reference to the categories that you've tagged your post to. So it's going to be a ID pipe separated ID field. So we can use that to grab the items that we're pointing at there. I'm going to put those into a model and I'm going to pass those to my partial view. Okay, if we go and have a look at the partial view, so we've got this one here, entry categories. Okay, so nothing too special going on here. We're going to check that we've got entry categories. We're going to iterate over those, and then we're going to generate the URL and pull out the title from the appropriate field there as well. Now, just to tie this all together, let's go and have a look at the model. So we're using entry categories model, which is right here. Okay, so it's a fairly simple model. I've got a category items property, which that's the thing we're iterating over. And to initialize one of these, I need to pass it a group of items that is going to become the category items. Now, that code itself is quite simple and quite straightforward, but there's many problems with it. Okay, let's start here in the view. First problem we have in the view, we have business logic in here. One second. Now you might be looking at that code saying, hang on, where's the business logic? We are accessing a field here to pull out a title, that's business logic. We're generating URLs, that's business logic. So yeah, it's a little bit of a gray area where you make the distinction between business logic and just regular old development or view development. But the problem here is, what if the title field changed? What if the name of it changed? What if we didn't read it directly from the title? What if we had to join it together from several other fields and whatnot? So it's the classic problem of or the wrong level of abstraction in the view. Okay, we shouldn't be mucking around with items in here. So what I want to do, I want to clean this up. I want to stop doing my business logic inside the view. The other problem with doing business logic here is it's much more difficult to test. So in fact, it's almost impossible to test. I would need to execute this view to be able to validate the output that the business logic was creating. So I want to package it up in a much more, in a much nicer format that allows me to test it more easily. Okay, so to control, what we're going to do, we're going to move the business logic out of the view and we're going to push that into the place where it belongs, which is the controller, right? So let's start doing that. The first thing I need is a new model class. So I've already prepared one of those here. This is the category model. So if we go back to the view and have a look at the data that we're using here and what we need from the category items, we need the URL and we need the title. Okay, and that's what we've got over here on the category model. I've got a title field and I've got a URL field. So we need to populate those from the controller and push them down to the view. So first thing we should do, we should modify this existing view so it's using categories rather than items. So let's modify that to be category, and I'll update this name here. And this is going to bite me later because I have to make sure I update this property name everywhere I use it. Okay, we're passing in category now, so that's going to be categories. Okay, there we go. And if we remove the unused usings, so we've now got a slightly cleaner model that we're passing to the view, so a slightly cleaner view model. We're not using item in here, so this should be easy to test. Now, I've made many updates to the model. I need to go and make those updates in here as well in the views. So I'll just make the updates here. So this was, we change that to categories. Okay, we're going to iterate over the categories. We'll call that category. Okay, now I don't need these two lines anymore because I'm just going to be pulling out the URL from the category type and the title, but I do want to use that logic in the controller, so I'll quickly go and dump it over there. And that one as well. Okay, and then I can replace this with category dot, for some reason my Italian sense is not working, URL, and the same down here, this is now category dot title. Okay. I don't need this using up here because I'm no longer using link manager in the page. So there we go. We've now cleaned up the model. So there's no logic in the model now. We're doing a bit of iteration, but I wouldn't call that business logic. Okay, so our model is now, our view is now clean. Okay, next step is to create or move all of that logic into the controller. So we've got the items there. I'll extract those to a separate variable. And now I can create categories from that. From item in items, I'm going to select, a new category. And the title is going to be access the field there. So item title field and URL is going to be that thing there. Okay, fix up the imports. There we go. And now I can just feed my categories to my model. And that should work. Okay, well, it will work, but it's still not in a good state yet. So this is now testable to an extent. We can actually set context item in tests, although it's probably not a good idea to because it reduces the reuse of the code. But the big thing we're going to struggle with here is the static link manager. And beyond that, although we've moved the business logic into the controller, this is a web entry point. I just made a reference to it just now. This logic in here is not reusable. We can't reuse this in any other context, right? So if I was creating another component that also needed to iterate over the categories of the item, I can't do that because this logic is embedded directly in here in the controller. So what I'd like to do is pull that out and encapsulate it in a separate method. And in doing so, I'm going to make this logic much easier to test. Because if I'm testing a controller, I may have web concerns that are starting to get in the way. I might need to fiddle with headers, or I might need to fiddle with cookies, or whatever the case might be. In my view, the controller should just be responsible for marshalling the requests coming in to palm off to the actual business logic, wherever that happens to be, and then preparing the response to go back to the caller. We shouldn't have the actual business logic itself inside the controller. So I'm going to extract this to a new taxonomy class. So let's create a folder in here called taxonomy. And this is to do with entries. So I'm going to create a class called entry taxonomy. Okay. And the method can be IEnumerable of category. Whoops, did I spell that right? Should have. Get categories. And we'll dump the logic in there. Okay. And we have to return categories from there. And we have to fix up the usings, but for some reason, my usings are getting a bit liberal. So we'll just say, oops, items right there. And fields. And link manager. Okay. Cool, remove the unused. So there we go, we've now encapsulated that logic, and this would be, it's not quite easily testable just yet. As I said, we're still using a static down here, and that's going to cause problems in our test. And we're still using a context item. So although it is testable, it's not as nice as it could be. So what I'd like to do to make this much more testable, I want to use dependency injection. So the whole idea of dependency injection is don't make your classes go and find their stuff, give them their stuff. Okay, and when following that principle, in a test scenario, I can give you a fake version of the thing and you use that rather than you using the real thing. So I can control the behavior of the mock much more easily. Okay, so the first thing we'll do, we'll pass the item in here. I'll call that entry item so it doesn't clash with the variable below. Okay, and we'll replace the context item with that. Okay, so this now allows me to reuse this piece of code outside of just the context item. Okay, so if I was using context item, I couldn't use this logic if I was, for example, generating the post list view where I need to iterate over a number of different items because it previously was using the context item. So by passing in the item, I can tell it which item I want the categories for. So it makes this piece of code much more usable. The last thing we want to do is replace this. So we use dependency injection to get the link manager. And rather than grabbing, well, the link manager here is actually a static. So it does make it much more difficult for test scenarios. So what I'm going to use is the link manager abstraction. So these were the abstractions that were introduced in Sitecore 8.2, and it makes testing much easier. So we're going to inject the base link manager there. And we'll store a local copy of that so we can use it down below. Okay, link manager equals link manager. And now I can replace that static call with the injected instance. And now if I clean up the usings, so there we go. We've extracted the logic out of the controller. It's now standalone. It's much more reusable because I can tell it which item I want to use, and I'm injecting all of the dependencies. So this is much easier to test as well. So with that, let's go and start creating tests for it. So I've got my unit test project up here. I'm going to create a folder in here for taxonomy, and I'll create a class in here for the tests for this class. So it's going to be entry taxonomy tests. Now I've got a couple of other tests up here already which aren't working. So I've got some controller tests, but I ran into a problem when I needed to mock some items. And that's why everyone came, right? You want to see me mock some items. So we'll get to that in a moment. Back to the entry taxonomy tests. I'm using xunit and substitute in my test project. So I'm going to be creating facts. So first unit test, what are we testing? Let's go back to our class that we are testing. Now, in production code, I would add a test for the constructor and make sure link manager wasn't null and all the rest of it. But in the interest of time, I'll skip over that. So I'm going to show you the interesting Sitecore related tests, not necessarily all the tests you should be writing. So we're going to be testing the get categories method. So I generally follow the naming convention that Roy Oshrove sets out in the art of unit testing. So it's the unit of work we're testing, the condition we're testing. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to test when entry item is null. The item is null. And then the last piece of the method name is what you expect to happen. So if the item is null when we're getting categories, what should we do? We can throw an exception. It would be a little nicer if we just returned empty. Returns empty. Okay, following the arrange act assert pattern. So we'll start with our arrange. We need our system under test. So this is just a convention that many people use. System under test means the thing that you are testing. In this case, we are testing entry taxonomy. Oops, I forgot to say new. Okay, that needs a base link manager. So because I'm using the abstraction, it makes it much easier to mock in a test scenario. If I wasn't mocking for my test scenario, I would have to pass in a real link manager, and that could have, that's a problem because that starts invoking much more code and it increases the scope of the test. So I'm going to say link manager equals substitute or base link manager. Now I can pass that mocked link manager into my system under test. Okay, next thing I need to do is that was arrange, we're now doing an act. So this is where we invoke the system under test. So get categories, and I'm going to pass it null. And then we do our asserts. So assert that the result is empty. Okay, clean up and build. Now this is going to fail because I changed one of the signatures of something. So we'll just go in here and this was changed. So this is the controller test. The very first thing I did early on, I changed the model so that the property was called categories rather than category items. Okay, so I need to change that there to get it to compile. This is a skipped test, so we won't be invoking it, doesn't matter. Okay, build was successful. Let's run this test. And the very first thing it should do is fail. Okay, that was expected. The reason it's failing is because we're actually not checking whether the entry item is null or not. We're just using the properties directly off it. So that's why we're getting a null reference exception. So if the passed in item is null, return enumerable empty category. Whoops. Okay, let's go back up to our test and do another build. And then if we run this again, we get a pass. Cool. Now, we've already got one test here. We can use this as the skeleton for our next couple of tests. So I'll just quickly copy that. Now, what's the next test we're going to write? Okay, we need to pass in a real item. Now, if we trace through the logic of the code here, we've kind of got two cases. We've got one case where we get items back from the category field, and we've got a case where we get no items back from the category field. So we'll take the simple case first. We'll say when we have no items coming back. Okay, so we're still testing get categories. The condition we're testing now is item has categories. Sorry, there are no categories. And it should return empty. Okay, so basically we need to pass an item in here. So this is probably what most of you came here for. Time to mock an item. Var item equals substitute for item. It's not quite that simple. Let me put the using in. Using Sitecore data items. Okay, there we go. Now, if we go and have a look at the interface for the item, it doesn't have a parameterless constructor. So nsubstitute can't mock it. Sorry, it can't mock it with that particular overload that I'm using. We have to pass it the constructor parameters to satisfy the constructor. So I need an ID, an item, data, and a database. So let's go and create those. So, sorry, let's go and pass those in. So ID, we can generate IDs really easily. New ID. Item data, we can use the empty item data that's a static, and want to pass in a database. Rather than creating another substitute inline there, I'll just create it on the line up here. Equals substitute for database. Okay, and then we can pass it in. We've just mocked an item. How cool is that? Now, when you're mocking, you take full responsibility for the behaviors of the thing that you are mocking. So how are we using the item in our code? We're going to use the fields property. So I need to mock the fields property as well. We're going to use the indexer of that, so we have to mock that. And then we may need to do a few other things as well. So once we've got our item, let's set up the fields for it. So var fields equals, fields is a field collection, but that actually has logic in it. So we're going to substitute, we're going to mock that one as well. So field collection. And it also doesn't have a parameterless constructor. We need to pass it an item. So we'll pass it the item we've already mocked. Okay. Now we need to configure item to return that fields when you access the fields properties. So item fields returns, this is all in substitute, the fields mock. Okay, so now when we access fields, we'll get something back. We need to configure the indexer of fields to pass us back a field. So let's start by mocking the field. Var field equals substitute for a field. Let's go and check the interface for that. No parameterless constructor, we need an ID and an item. So just create a new ID there, and the item can be the item we already have here. Okay. So now I can set the field value I want to be returned from here. So this would be the case where we've got no categories, so we can just return an empty field value. So I'll say dot value equals empty. I need to put this into the fields collection, so that will be returned. So fields, we're using the index of that. I've got to make sure I get the casing right here. So because we're accessing by string, and there's no logic here other than what we're mocking, so we've got to be careful of the casing here for our tests. So I'll make sure I'm accessing by the right case. Dot returns field. Okay. Did we do everything right here? We need to pass item into the test here. Okay, let's build that. Cool, and let's run that. Fingers crossed that I got everything right. This almost never works the first time. Oh, something's going wrong, it worked. Okay. And then the next test we want to write is a much more complex test. So in the next test, if we go back and have a look at our logic. So we're now testing this branch where we've got no items. We now need to set it up so that we do get real items back. Okay, so this is going to mean we need to create the category items and put those IDs into the field here, and we need to be able to access them. So if I just copy this code and start writing my next test, you can kind of imagine it's going to get very unwieldy because we're going to be creating more items, potentially setting more fields and whatnot. So I'm going to do a bit of refactoring to this test first and extract out these utility methods as methods. So private item, create item. We're going to pass in the database. So I'll grab the item creation code, and I'm going to say that the fields collection is part of the item more than individual fields. So I'll put that with that. Okay, we'll put that there, and then we can return item database. Okay, so all I've done is moved that code down here, so then I can create my items var item with a simple call to this method. Okay, pass in the database. And the next thing I'd like to do is set up a method for setting a field in the item. So private void set item field, pass in the item, pass in the field name, pass in the field value. Okay, go and copy this code from up here and drop that down here. Okay, so we're going to substitute the actual field itself for attaching it to the item. The value should be whatever we passed in here. And the field name, that's going to go into here. Now, where do we get that fields member from? We can get that off the item. So I'll replace that with item.fields. So when I access the item, I'm going to get back the mocked field collection there, okay? So that will all work. I don't need to return anything from there. Okay. So now I can say set item field item. The field name was category with a capital C, and field value was empty. Okay, now let's just make sure I didn't break anything through that refactoring. And we'll run those tests again. Did it run? There we go, it flashed, it must have run. So we didn't break anything, that's good. Now I can move on to the next case, which is the case where we're creating category items and we need to resolve those. So let's start with the target categories that we want to create and validate against. So what I'm doing here, I'm creating an array of categories that I want to be returned from my system under test. Just fix up some references there. So my category, I'm going to have two categories. I'm going to have the titles set and the URLs set as well. The name will be item has categories, and it returns the categories. Okay, now to make this work, I actually have to create more items, which are the categories themselves. So I'm going to do that in here. Cat1 equals create item. Pass in the database. And I need to set the title. So cat1, set item field, cat1, field name will be title, and the field value will be cat1. Now, rather than watching this fail spectacularly and fix it, I'll just jump ahead in the interest of time to show you what might happen. So going back to our code, we're actually accessing the fields of the category in a different way than we're accessing fields up here. So on the item itself, we're using the fields property. Down here, we're using the indexer directly on the item itself. My set item field doesn't do the indexer just yet. So let's go and add that. So I'll set up item field name returns the field value. So now it doesn't matter which way we use, either the indexer on the item or the field's property, it should return that field. Okay, so that will work for that. That's all good. Let's go and create category 2. Here's category 2. We'll set category 2's title to category 2. And the next thing I need to do is set up the link manager to be returning the appropriate URLs for these two. So I'll grab the link manager there, and we're going to, when we say get item URL, category 1 returns link 1. Same thing for category 2. Okay, so that's all set up. One thing we haven't done, again, jumping back to the code that we're about to execute, we're using a convenience on the multi-list field, get items, okay? Now, we have to be conscious of what this does under the hood. So under the hood, get items, it parses the field value, it pulls the IDs out of that, it uses the field.database property to then resolve those items to real items. So I need to make sure that in my mocks and my setups, it will respect that logic as well. So when I'm so first things first, I need this database, rather than just being a placeholder, which is what we're using it for at the moment. It needs to actually do something. We're going to end up calling get item on it. So whenever I create a new item, I'm going to set up the database to return it if you ask for it. So get item, it should just be by ID. So item.id returns item. Now, you may recall the Sitecore API has many overloads. So if I was getting the item with a string ID, I'd need to add another setup for that. If I'm using path or name, I'd need to add another setup for that. I know that my code is only going to use the ID, so I can leave it at this one. The other thing I need to make sure is field.database resolves. So field, .database .returns, and I can just use the item.database for that, which is the database that we've got up there. Okay. Last thing we need to do up here, sorry, not quite last, but getting there. The field value for category here now needs to reference these two items that I've created. So it's going to be cat1 ID pipe, cat2.id. Okay, that's all good, but it's not going to be empty anymore. It's going to actually be the categories up here. So we'll copy that and we'll say equal, and that's the expectation. We're going to check the results. Now, normally if you were to compare two collections of categories, it would always say false because it's doing a object identity comparison rather than a reference comparison. So it's doing a reference comparison rather than a value comparison. So I've got a comparer in here that I can use. This is the category comparer. Didn't spell that right. Okay, whoops. If we go and have a look at what this is, it's just a very simple comparer class, implements iEquality comparer, and it's just going to make sure that these two categories, when you pass them in, are actually equal. Okay. Now, one last hiccup. The types that we're returning here are different. I've got an array here, and what's returning here is an IEnumerable. So XUnit is going to fail immediately on that. So to overcome that, I'm just going to toArray the enumerable, the type's the same, and XUnit will let it through. Okay, build that. Now this one is surely to fail the first time because the other one just succeeded first time. So we'll run that test and we'll see how we go. It's always bad when things work too easily, isn't it? Something's bound to blow up at some point. But okay, it's working. Brilliant. I've obviously rehearsed this enough times that I remembered all of the nuances. So we're pretty much done there. The entry taxonomy now is being tested properly. We're executing we're accessing the field value from the item. We're getting real items. We're creating categories from them. We're comparing them. It's all good. So those tests I would call done. It's now time to go back to the controller and start using the entry taxonomy. So I could just put a new entry taxonomy in here. Now, the reason I don't want to do that, dependency injection, right? I mentioned dependency injection before. If we hard-coded entry taxonomy instance in here, then this controller can only ever use entry taxonomy. What if I wanted to tweak entry taxonomy to be slightly different? Or more to the point in our case, I want to be able to control the entry taxonomy for test purposes. So the way that we do that is through dependency injection. So let me back that out. We're going to inject my entry taxonomy. Now, before we inject it, I better abstract it. So if I injected entry taxonomy, it's a concrete implementation. There's no virtuals on here, and substitute couldn't override the methods and how they behave. So we'll create an interface from it, and that allows us to substitute that much more easily for tests. So we'll extract an interface. That one will do. The interface just has the one method on it. Okay, and entry taxonomy is implementing that. Let's copy that. Let's jump back to our controller and we can inject one of those. Okay, so entry taxonomy and entry taxonomy, whoops. And we'll store that in a member variable. Okay, and we can use this thing now for resolving the categories. So entry taxonomy.get categories, and we're going to pass it. The item will be the context item. Okay, clean up the usings. We're pretty much back to the cleanliness of the code at the start, right? But in a much better state. Let's go and complete the tests for the controller now. So the nice thing is, I don't need to mock or shouldn't need to mock items now to get my controller test to work, because all of my item accessing is contained to the entry taxonomy. So we've broken the interface here because we now need to pass in an entry taxonomy. So let's mock that. The taxonomy equals substitute for entry taxonomy. Oops. No. We can pass that into our system on the test. Better take the skip off here so the test actually runs. What are we doing? When the index method is called, returns the partial view. Okay, so we're not actually testing any logic here. We're just testing the types that are returned are correct. So I shouldn't need to set the context item, although just to be complete and to make sure that we're not hitting some kind of edge case, let's make sure that the entry taxonomy behaves as we expect. So let's set up that a bit further and say get categories. When we get any item, oops. We want to return an empty category array. Because it's IEnumeral, that should be fine. Okay, so we've already told that this is how you should be behaving. We're not actually checking the result there of the category. We're checking the type of the partial that was returned. Okay, so that one should be good. Let's go and enable this one. So what are we doing this one? Context item has no categories. Cool, that's basically what we've got up here, right? So we're saying there are no categories, we don't expect any categories to be returned. And we're going to validate the result we get is empty. And then the last one, this will be the more complex one. This is the one where we are actually expecting categories to be returned. So rather than writing out that category array, I'll go and steal it from our entry taxonomy tests. Okay, we can reuse this one. So these are the categories we expect. We'll tell the taxonomy to return those. So I'm using a little, I'm using a little trick here from nsubstitute where I can tell it any parameter that you pass me that is an item. I don't care what the item is. And that could be null as well. So it's going to return those. And then we can go and do our comparison. So in our equality check, we're going to be checking that we got back categories. Okay, that's not called category items anymore. That's called actually categories. And we need to make sure we use the category comparer so it can compare the values of those rather than the references. Okay, you're good, great, let's build that. Build succeeded, let's go and run the tests for the controller. So you can see test runs from preparation. Let's go and rerun. So these should come back green. Awesome, no coding problems. Okay, so with that controller is done. It's testable. It doesn't contain the logic inside the controller anymore. That's been abstracted out. That's all good. We've probably just barely got enough time. Oh, sorry, one thing I should mention, quite important. So we're using dependency injection in the controller now. If we want our controllers in Sitecore to participate in dependency injection, we have to register the controllers themselves into the services container. So I've got a config file here that does that. So I'm just going to enable that. And the other thing I need to do, I need to register the entry taxonomy service itself. So let's go and create a new config file. Application config file. This can just be called services.config. And we'll drop the registration in there. So this is simply registering the concrete implementation of entry taxonomy against that interface. Now the nice thing with dependency injection is it takes care of all of the dependencies for you, of your dependencies. So entry taxonomy itself also has dependencies. It requires the base link manager. So when Sitecore is providing that to my controller here, it takes care of that chain of dependencies for me. Now, to make sure the build works, I need to make sure that's of type content. So I've got a couple of MS build magic that will just copy that across to my target location. And just to make sure that we can see that I actually did something, let me go and just say, I'll alter this so that we can see it did actually build. Now, I think we're probably getting close to running out of time. We'll see how we go. The last thing I did want to do is go over the rendering, the view rendering. So I've also got a view rendering in here. The reason I went with a controller for this presentation is just because I think it's a little easier to be able to keep track of the different parts, the model and whatnot. In a view rendering, we don't have the controller, we've just got the model, and the model is kind of the entry point as well. So it makes it a touch more confusing for explanation. Let's build all of this. If we have time, we can come back and fix this one up. Should only take a few minutes. So rebuild succeeded. Let's jump back to my Sitecore instance and refresh that. And if nothing blew up, we should be able to see this rendered basically exactly as it is, but with the altered text that I added in there. I feel like I should do a race. Whilst that's going, let's see how quickly I can refactor this. So to refactor this one, we have to stop using
the heads up, you got about 4 or 5 minutes and we've got a few questions for you.
Oh, all right. Let's not race then. Let's just go and make sure that this worked. Thank you for the heads up. Just sit here and twiddle our thumbs for a moment. I knew that I was going against the clock trying to get all of that both of them refactored. The refactoring of the view model though is actually quite simple now because we've already extracted all of the logic, right? It's the exact same logic, so I can just use the existing entry taxonomy. I can inject that into my view rendering. Just a tiny bit of magic to make that work. So we'll put that into the background. By default, view models don't participate in dependency injection. So to make this work, in the sample project, I do have a small tweak. So I've got an initialized pipeline processor that will swap out the model resolver for a custom model resolver that I've got in here, which we can find in here. Okay, it's not very complex. All it does is if I give it the model name, it will go and resolve that from the container, or it will use the container during the resolution of the model. So yeah, if you're going to go and use, if you want to use dependency injection with your view models, you'll need to go and use this. So this is almost done. Ah, there we go, it works. So posted in, broke the formatting completely, and there's our output. So you can see I didn't actually break anything. Okay, let's go back to presentation and quickly fly through these last few slides. Oh, why did you start from the start? Okay, I'll get this done in 2 minutes. So a couple of principles that I was following. Keep business logic out of the views. It makes it more difficult to test and it spreads logic over several different locations. So it's unwieldy, and this isn't even specific to Sitecore. Many people would say you should have logicless views. Keep items out of your model. That's a bit dogmatic. There are times when you will need an item in your model, but generally it's a smell, and you should be suspicious of it. It makes it much more difficult to create things. So from a test perspective, you can mock the item, but in production, for example, if you're pulling this thing out of content search, you can't new up items in production. They have to come out of the database. So it's definitely a suspicion. Keep the business logic out of the web entry points. Otherwise, you can't reuse that logic anywhere else. Avoid using implicit data. So I didn't call this one out specifically, but Sitecore context item is implicit data. It makes your code less reusable because you can only use it with the context item then. Avoid using static classes because you can't control them in a test scenario. Some good points: use dependency injection because it allows us to control our dependencies for tests, and it also makes your code more flexible because you can change implementations later on. Another example of that was in the controller as well. So if you want to have a look at the code, I've got a repository up on GitHub. You can grab the URL there. There's a QR code if you want to quickly snap that one as well, if you can't be bothered typing. I have got tags on each of the commits so you can follow the progression through of the very start, adding the test project, improving the code, and adding the tests and whatnot. You can find me on these couple of social channels. I did just join Sitecore Slack. I've been resisting for a long time. I'm not sure I really get Slack. So you can find me on those channels. And with that, thank you very much. And let's open to questions.
I'll teach you Slack. So there are lots of questions.
Thanks for the presentation, Alistair.
No worries.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Which Visual Studio extension is being used to highlight whether a test has passed or failed?
It's probably ReSharper. It got in my way again. I actually thought it was native. So you're talking about when we're over here looking at a test, this little dot here?
Right.
Is that the one? If that's the one, no, that's actually native Visual Studio. So I do have ReSharper in here, but I think it disabled itself. But I'm pretty sure that is native Visual Studio. This is VS 2019.
All right. You switched the field output from using field renderer to just field value. How would you build the unit test support experience editor field edit support? Yeah,
so that's where you would need to, you have to be conscious of what you're intending to do with your model. So in my case, my model was being used as a POCO, right? It goes onto the page here, and you don't intend to edit these things here. If I was trying to handle this, for example, which is the main content of the page, yeah, the way that I would do that is I would have the model itself stays nice and POCO-ish, and then there would be, so I would probably have a field that exposes the item URI or something like that, and possibly an extension method or a utility method to go and resolve that from a database. So from a testing perspective, I can validate the item URI I got back is correct, not necessarily the item itself. If we go and have a look at what I'm doing with the logic in the view, right, I'm just dumping out what I've got in there here. So if I substituted this doesn't participate in the tests at all. So I could actually be, so if I had a, resolve item, for example, and then use the field renderer with that, if that makes sense.
All right, couple more minutes for questions. What about marking the Sitecore content API? Can that be done?
The Sitecore content API?
Right.
Well, that's basically what I did, right? So in my tests here, I'm calling, well, I'm not specifically calling, but some of the code that I'm calling is calling database.getItem. And all of that is mocked and injected. So it might have, I apologize if it wasn't too easy to follow, but things like in here where I say database.getItem, I'm configuring out the content API right there, right? So if I call on my mock database, get item and this specific ID, I'll get that mocked item back. So what I was doing here was all about mocking the data API, the content API.
Okay. How do you account for the experience editor once you refactor the title field out into a string?
Well, again, in my example, I wouldn't want to be editing the category fields here. So in my case, it was perfectly fine. But if I needed experience editor support, I would do as I did before. And in the title, I would have some kind of utility here, utility method to go and resolve the actual item that this is pointing at. So what I've got in category is basically a POGO representation of the data that I want to use. And then let's just quickly go in so I can highlight what I mean. What I can do here, I can also say public URI, which is a data URI, system URI. No, it's a Sitecore, so item URI, isn't it? Sitecore.data.URI, item URI. I haven't used that in a while. Category item URI, right? So if I've got that there, and then I could expose actually I could do it as an extension method, or I could expose it directly here. So public, give me a real item, resolve item, right? In this method here, we could use this URI to go in, and I could do something really bad, like, just straight database.getItem, because the URI has a database in it. And then with that in place, I can use that inside my view. So I can actually use a field renderer. So I could say Sitecore.field, I can't remember the format of this, category dot blah, 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 and the field name, right? So the point being, in the entry taxonomy, when I'm just dealing with POCOs, I can do all of my testing on that. I'm not actually testing the view itself. So having a logicless view is good because I don't need to test anything inside of it. I still don't really want to test this because this specific line here is ejecting a lot of HTML. And if your tests consist of parsing HTML to see if the HTML was right, you might be a bit too specific in your tests.
All right, I think we're out of time for questions, but thank you very much, Alistair, for that. And if I know there's other questions here, if you have questions for Alistair, show him why we use Slack. Reach out to him on Slack with your questions.
Ping him, constantly ping him on Slack so he stays there.
If I could just make a quick
find him on
request.
Twitter. Find him on Twitter.
I would actually
Slack.
But don't DM him. Do it in a public channel so everybody else learns, please.
Well, no, I wasn't trying to avoid things. I was going to suggest, could you please actually instead put the questions up on Stack Overflow? If I can get back to my presentation and get to
Stack Exchange.
Stack Exchange.
Stack Exchange. Please put it on Stack Exchange for everyone to see. So for people that like to live in caves like me that don't want to get on Slack, they can find it.
Well, thanks again.
Still like seeing you around though.
Thanks, folks.
All right, thanks, Alistair.
Thanks, guys.
All right, so transitioning to our next speaker who walked away. We have Vincent Liu, my other best friend from Down Under. I have lots of friends down under.
Hello.
Vincent is a solution architect at Isobar in Melbourne, Australia. He's, like I said, he's my best friend. He's going to show us some great stuff. I think, what, CDN with Cloudflare and Akamai with resizing images, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And I'm very interested in this talk because I actually use those technologies and want to see how you go with that. So we have a few minutes. We have about 8 minutes. We can do a little bit of chit chat and talk about the weather.
I'll start setting up.
We want to please donate to the cause that we have going. It goes to people on the front lines that are battling COVID-19. You know, let's not forget, you know, the power of the community can actually help out with people that are suffering right now. Please, any penny would help. You know, I mean, just think about it. You know, you might spend $5 for a cup of coffee, but you know, if you give $5, you might be saving a life.
Yeah, there's a lot of people working very hard on the front lines, behind the scenes, and I think the WHO are doing great work. And it's not just about North America and Europe. I think they're doing some great work all around the world, especially in the more deprived countries. So yeah, please donate as much as you can.
Right.
I know it's I know everyone's struggling a bit, but yeah, every little helps. And if you're not already on there, then there's also a Slack channel, a Zoom room as well. You can join and just chat in the background amongst yourselves, talk about the sessions going on, or just have a bit of a break between yourselves. It's also very tough being cooped up inside all day, so it's nice to get together with a community like this, even virtually, and just talk about all the talks and all the great stuff that we're all working on. And yeah, it'd be great to see you in there in a bit.
Or you can chat about the fact that Mike Reynolds has tan lines from his sunglasses.
I can't explain this. I haven't like really left this building in like weeks.
So how are you getting a tan?
It's got to be this light.
Are you just like staring out the window all day? Is that what it is?
Well, the window's right here, but who knows? So I was asked a question, and this goes back to the SUGCON North America. Actually, somebody asked what your background was. The montage.
Oh, this one is the lip sync montage thing, which is banned in the US, by the way. But Cameras was able to get it for me. This is what we had all the presenters do for us at SUGCON North America, the only SUGCON which was ever done. We had 300 odd people. So all the presenters had to lip sync to a song. And that's Michael West and Adam and his kids. So they had to lip sync to a song. Quite a few of the presenters did oblige and do it for us, including John. That's Tim. But some didn't, you know, they thought it was unprofessional, but I really think that was fun. And the stuff behind Cameras is Mike and I dancing to a couple of the songs. So Ice Ice Baby, and what's the other one? Jump Around, right, Mike?
Yeah, Jump Around.
Yeah. And then behind Jason, you see his drone flying skills.
I think that's Jason's drone flying over his land. I heard.
Yeah, the hundreds of acres he owns.
It's not my land.
Well,
it is part of the family estate.
It could be. Is all I'm gonna say. And behind Mike, you can see a beautiful center table laid out against the wall for the past God knows how long.
Oh, it's almost 2.5 years.
2.5 years,
so
and then
put a coffee table together.
Yeah. And then behind Brucey Juicy or Juicy Brucey, he's in the cosmos, floating around.
It's 420 somewhere, I guess.
Somewhere here in Kiwi land.
Mike, there's a question for you.
There's a-
What is DXG?
That is a very good question. I don't know. I
No
found
one
this shirt.
knows.
I just found this shirt. I don't know where this came from. I just found it. JCPenney. It was on the discount rack. So I mean, it just looked kind of cool. It was cheap. It was about $5. So
Always the important modules.
huh?
Always the important module, apparently, DXG, but nobody knows what it is. I think the guy, whoever made it, has done a very bad marketing job.
I don't even think he does Sitecore anymore.
I think he needs to get on Twitter and let people know what DXG is.
I don't even know who you're talking about. Yeah, shout out to Zachary Nebo. This is a Sitecore module that he built that does all kinds of crazy stuff. Does some UML stuff. It does some other stuff that he's added to it. So that's what this module is. Check it out. Shameless plug for him. You know, I expect $20 afterwards. Giving a shout out.
I'll buy you that coffee that you're supposed to get.
All right, you almost ready, Vincent?
Yes, I'm ready now. Yeah.
All right.
I mean, you can kick it off now if you want. I mean, we're 2 minutes early, maybe a minute and a half, but I think it's fine.
Almost ready, bro? All right. All right, so our next talker is Vincent Louis. He's a Sitecore MVP out of Australia, and he's going to be going over some amazing work that he's been doing with on web performance, image resizing on the CDN using Cloudflare and Akamai. It should really make your Sitecore solutions fly. So let's hand over, give you control.
Okay, show my screen. Which screen? Hang on.
So I got the one with your emails on at the moment.
You got my emails?
The one with the email at the top, yeah.
Yep, hang on. Oh God, this is embarrassing. Hang on. Let me...
We see the partner update.
Okay, all right. So I want to share the other screen instead.
You'll see a little screen option under the play button.
Sharing. Screen. Yep, that's the one. Found it. Monitor 2.
There you go. Now we see it.
Cool. Fantastic. Okay, just also let me start my recording as well. So give me 2 seconds.